Prevent Connect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or CALCASA.
Over to you, Alicia and Abina. Welcome.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, everyone. Good to have you on. Also, Abina, if you want to say hello to everyone.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
So today we're talking all about economic opportunity, and our objectives are to identify the role that sexual and domestic violence prevention practitioners are starting to take. So we know that this is a new area of exploration for a lot of folks, and so, we really want to, this is why it's a getting started type of session. We have a few guests that will be sharing real-world examples of how they're partnering with other sectors to support economic opportunity, and we're lucky enough to have guests today that are both within the sexual and domestic violence prevention field and also guests who are outside of the field partnering with them. So I always love when we can have external partners also share on these web conferences. And then at the end, we're going to have a great group discussion with everyone on how to deal with pushback that supporting economic opportunities is beyond the sexual and domestic violence prevention lane, and really talk about what the added value is of engaging in this space. So with that, I wanted to contextualize this a little bit. And we know there's a ton of different economic justice movements that are in existence right now, and lots of people across the country working on a number of economic opportunity-related issues that really do tie into the prevention of sexual and domestic violence. So from things like paid leave to one fair wage, which is all about eliminating the lower tipped wage that people in tipped wage fields are faced with. We know there's a lot of work around hotel worker rights and salaries, income living wages for hotel workers, as well as domestic workers. And this is just to name a few of the current movements that are happening. There's a lot more, but I wanted to just share a few examples. And we know that economic opportunity is a robust predictor of health and safety, and it affects the living conditions of entire communities. When communities have local ownership of assets, accessible and stable employment that pays living wages, and access to investment opportunities, they're more likely to thrive. However, when communities face high unemployment rates or have weak economic and social policies, for example, their risk of multiple forms of violence increases, whether it's intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or child maltreatment, community violence. We've seen ties to a number of safety and health issues. And so the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has released technical packages, which we've mentioned on Prevent Connect many times in the past, but I wanted to highlight both the intimate partner and the sexual violence packages, because in both of them, they have a strategy around strengthening economic support for women and families and draw the links between these forms of violence and how strengthening economic support can really support prevention. And it talks about how things like poverty, financial stress, and low income can increase risk. So economic security in the technical packages, it talks about how it depends on women having access to full and equal workforce participation, having comparable salaries, options, income generating options, and not even just thinking about income, but also those work supports like affordable quality childcare or paid family and medical leave that really support women in the workplace. And these supports can then contribute to family stability and also decrease gender inequality. So these are just some things that I pulled out from the technical packages for all of you today. And we have shared the link in the text chat if you do want to read up more on what the CDC says about that strategy. Another resource that I wanted to highlight up front is this one called Closing the Wealth Gap. So it talks all about how addressing the gender income gap is part of the solution of building women's economic security, but it's actually not enough. So it really makes the case that we need to be thinking about wealth as thinking about things like saving for college, secure retirement, resources to be leveraged into investments like a home or a business, and about how wealth can be passed on from generation to generation. So not just thinking about income, but also wealth as a solution for economic security. And so the report begins with an overview of what wealth is, why it matters. It summarizes some key data on the causes and effects of the wealth gap, and also points to some promising policy and practical solutions at the national, state, and local levels. So definitely recommend checking out that resource too. And we're going to be sharing quite a few resources at the end too, so hopefully those of you who are wanting to get started on this issue have a lot of resources in addition to what our guests are sharing today.
Yeah, Alicia, I just wanted to mention that we're really grateful that we have the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. We have Ann Menard to be able to share and highlight some of the resources out there on supporting economic opportunity. So we'll hear from Ann at the end.
Yes, definitely. So definitely stay tuned for more sharing then. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first guest from Ohio. So we had Rebecca Klein from the Ohio Domestic Violence Network help with preparing this session, and then unfortunately she's unable to join us today, but luckily enough we do have Erin Ryan from the Ohio Women's Public Policy Network, who has been partnering with Rebecca and is going to help fill in some of Rebecca's sections and also share about the partnership that they're engaged in. So Erin is the Managing Director at the Ohio Women's Public Policy Network, a coalition convened of more than 30 organizations working collaboratively to advance policies that create economic security for women and strengthen families. She has years of experience in Ohio politics, working in fundraising and field operations for races. Ryan received her undergraduate degree in political science and women's, gender, and sexuality studies from the Ohio State University and currently resides in Columbus with her fiance, Darren. Hi, Erin. Thank you so much for joining us today and also helping fill in for some of Rebecca's portions.
Of course. Happy to be here.
So our first question for you today is, how did the Ohio Domestic Violence Network start engaging in this work around economic supports for prevention? So I know that you are one of the early partners of the network, and we really want to get more insight into how a domestic violence agency kind of got started on this.
Of course. So we had been working with the Ohio Domestic Violence Network as one of our coalition partners with the Women's Public Policy Network. So we were approached by Rebecca late last year as they were applying for the Delta grant, talking about how this grant cycle would be different. They would be required to include one program, one policy effort at the state level specifically for this grant project. As they began to contemplate what the project or program would be, they started to research wages and poverty rates here in Ohio. At the time that they began that initial research, child poverty was 22%, and infant mortality in Ohio for people of color, specifically for Black women, was 17 for every 1,000 live births, which is worse than many third world countries. So as they began to think about how poverty is a social determinant of health associated with higher rates of different forms of violence, they knew that wages were suppressed in Ohio since the late 1970s for all workers, And they really began to contemplate what a raise in wages could potentially do to foster economic growth, community cohesion, and ultimately reduce rates of intimate partner violence. They began to look at the landscape in the Ohio General Assembly, realizing that there were a few different policy issues, a few different bills specifically related to raising the minimum wage. One of the groups that was specifically working on that bill was Policy Matters Ohio. They are a policy think tank based here in Ohio that does a lot of statewide work. So before Rebecca applied for the grant, she began to do some outreach to partners like myself and like Policy Matters who were already working in these economic and workplace issues to kind of get an idea of the work that we were doing and approaching us about joining on if they did receive this grant to really help bolster some of their work in these the workplace minimum wage issues. So Policy Matters and myself, the Ohio Women's Public Policy Network, joined on or agreed to join on if the Domestic Violence Network was awarded this grant. Another group, Planned Parenthood of Greater Ohio, had already been engaged in previous work that they had done in this in the Delta grant in previous years. And they've also done some work specifically with looking at how wage issues really impact health. So they were also asked to join on to this smaller working group should they receive that grant. When they pitched the idea in their request, they said that they would work to build a bigger tent to support an increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour by or before the year 2023. As you can tell with me being on this call talking about the work that they were doing, they were eventually awarded that grant in February, and they were told you got funded, but, and from what Rebecca has shared, that was a very big but. They quickly learned that because the minimum wage work is legislated as a federal grantee, they could not propose working with legislators to increase a minimum wage. They couldn't work to build a coalition that would support a statewide ballot initiative because these actions would be considered lobbying. So they kind of went back to the drawing board to figure out how they could continue to work on some of these issues while not violating what was allowed of them as a federal grantee. They worked a lot with a project officer with the CDC who helped them think more broadly about how policy level work would be allowed with these federal grants. And ultimately that shifted to being less about pushing for a specific policy prescription of $15 an hour and more about thinking how they could impact living sustainable wages, paid time off, child care benefits, all of these issues that really impact worker wages and benefits. And that work began to shift to, again, thinking about how low-wage workers, specifically communities of color and women of color, were impacted by some of these policies that really did not support them economically, and how that has an impact on the women that they're hoping to serve.
And it sounds like this shift in focus really helped the network think more comprehensively about the issue and not just focus on one policy, but really what's supporting economic opportunity and who requires the supports the most. So I think that this is an important theme, especially for others that are on this web conference today that may have restrictions regarding lobbying at their agencies and how they can really go about taking on some of these issues that may be policy related. So that's very helpful. So I do want to turn it over to the audience and want to hear about what are some priority issue areas related to economic stability in your community or state that are gaining momentum. So we know there's certain policies or legislation that might be gaining momentum in your community, or we just want to hear from you what's coming up in your community, and you can share that in the text chat. So I already see some coming in about paid leave, livable wages, and we'll come back to this in a couple minutes to see what else others are saying. So while people are typing, Erin, can you share a little bit more about the issue of wage inequities in Ohio to help contextualize this for us?
Of course. So I'm going to share first some of what Rebecca has really focused on and some of what she kind of prepped, which you can see on the slide right now is a graph that really looks at how all of these issues are connected. When thinking about it as a community issue, what fosters violence and infant mortality, community conditions, we're really looking at how that is also connected to economic opportunities and low wages in those communities. As I said before, wages in Ohio have been stagnant or lowering, and a lot of our the workforces do not have robust benefit packages or benefits available to workers specifically in those lower wage workforces. So as you can see in the graph, we talked about how there is a direct connection between lack of economic opportunity and infant mortality, and all of these issues and all of these buckets here are connected. We can't think of it as separate things that don't have an impact on each other. From my perspective in the work that I've done, we have really looked at how women, particularly women of color, still face substantial barriers to achieving economic self-sufficiency. Women are more likely than men to remain at risk of economic insecurity at all stages of their life. We know, as I've mentioned before, a lot of the workplace policies are outdated. They have not really kept up with the pace of the changing dynamics of the American workforce, specifically looking at the increase in workforce participation from women. Our policies fail to reflect the role that women play both as caregivers and as breadwinners for their families. So when we think about, I guess, quote, women's issues, we have to think about how that connects to broader economic issues. Women's issues are family issues and they're economic issues. They can't be siloed into a separate category when we're doing our advocacy work. So our work is really focused on making sure we're applying a gender lens to every single policy issue that is coming out of the state legislature, specifically for workplace and economic issues that often are not discussed with a gender lens and how they impact women particularly. Women play a very crucial role in the economic stability of their families. 85% of Black mothers, 62% of Latina mothers, and 53% of white mothers are key breadwinners for their families on a national landscape. So when we're thinking about this work, specifically in the low-wage workforce that the Delta program is focusing on, we know there's a disproportionate impact on a lot of those policy issues for women specifically. Women in Ohio, nearly 7 in 10 minimum wage workers are women, and women of color represent a disproportionate share of these workers. So it's really important when we're thinking about wage equity, when we're thinking about workplace equity, that we are applying this gender lens to think about how women specifically are impacted by the lack of progress on many of these issues. And then when we look at wages for women, we know that there is a gender pay gap. In Ohio, that gap is slightly larger than the national average, with women typically earning, on average, 75 cents for every dollar a man makes. And that may seem small when you look at it from that perspective, but if we look across the year, that's an annual wage gap of $12,686. And then connecting it back to the beginning of this discussion on the wealth gap, this pay gap has a huge impact on women's lifetime earning potential and their lifetime wealth. When we look at pay disparities, applying a intersectional lens, we know that women of color face an even higher wage gap. Black women on average are paid 64 cents, Latinas are paid 61 cents for every dollar paid to a white non-Hispanic man. So failing to look at equal pay, again, not just impacting women's paychecks, but that longer term wealth attainment, investment, and retirement savings, this has a huge impact on women and their families that they're supporting. We know that women disproportionately experience domestic violence and sexual harassment and violence. And these are issues that not only affect the health and safety of women, but it permeates into the workforce. And so when we look at the issues that we work on as a coalition, we're always trying to take that economic lens on how women's economic security is impacted. The research, a recent research paper that was put out estimated that the average lifetime cost of intimate partner violence for women is $100,000 $103,767. So that's just a broader idea of what the landscape is for women, looking across a lot of these different economic issues that we focus on as a coalition.
Thank you for sharing all those numbers and really helping us understand the issue in Ohio. And I'm sure this really resonates for a lot of communities elsewhere in the country too. So going back to the text chat, we've been getting quite a lot of responses of different issues that have been coming up in your communities. Seems like paid leave has been a focus, affordable and quality childcare, living wages. With the paid family leave, I know we had Patricia say something about expanding use of paid leave. So often when we pass the policies, we think, oh, it's successful now, we have the policy. And so I know in California there's some work happening looking at how to expand the actual use of it, even once the policy has passed. And then another theme that came up, which I'm glad that someone mentioned, was housing. Sometimes in this discussion about economic opportunity, we leave out the conversation on housing, but if a lot of your income is going to your housing, then obviously that affects the wealth of communities as well. So I'm glad that was brought up. Anything else that Calcasa team or want to pull out?
I noticed we just had someone chime in about job readiness and opportunities for victims and survivors, and having those specifically for folks without documentation too. So thank you for bringing that up. And I also noticed that Erin had mentioned the recent Lifetime Economic Burden of Intimate Partner Violence report, and I just put the information how to access more material for that in the text chat.
Thanks, Tori. So Erin, I know that the Ohio Network Against Domestic Violence is in the early stages of connecting intimate partner violence prevention with economic security and wage equity. But can you share some of the initial directions for this work?
Of course. So this is a lot of what Rebecca has been working on to really bring us together for a smaller working group. As I mentioned, Policy Matters, the Women's Public Policy Network, and Planned Parenthood of Greater Ohio were all a part of that initial group that met. We'll touch on this a little bit later as that group has continued to evolve. But early on, and as we continue to kind of, this work continues to evolve, a lot of what Rebecca has been focused on is little p policy work. So again, making sure that it's within the confines of what they are able to do with their grant. Expanding partnerships, thinking about who's missing from the table, who needs to be part of these conversations, and how we can really look to building out the partnerships that the Domestic Violence Network has with folks here in Ohio. And with that comes some capacity building. And lastly, focusing on public education. So what the domestic violence can do with the funds that they're receiving is looking at doing some education and knowledge building of the policy landscape. So doing some issue briefs, infographics that can be pushed out broader to folks in their network and the different organizations that they are currently working with.
Great. And when we're talking about public education, I know we're not necessarily talking about individual level, but again, like going to different organizations, policy makers, businesses, and that sort of thing, if I understand correctly.
Yep, that is correct.
Okay. And Rebecca was also going to share her logic model. Erin, I don't know if you want to say anything here.
I can touch on this a little bit because this was brought up in our last meeting that we had with that working group. I know it's a little bit difficult to read. There's a lot happening, a lot of small text, but this is something that the domestic violence put together to really look at how, as they're expanding their partnerships, as they're educating folks on these issues and monitoring progress, that will ultimately lead to gender pay equity, decreasing harmful gender norms, and an increase in community cohesion. This is really how they connect all of this different work that they're just starting to build out as an organization. And one of the things that Rebecca had touched on as we were prepping for this call was really looking at how families who do not have secure, sustainable employment, what that offers with the living wage and benefits. And when we're looking at folks who are working 2 or 3 part-time jobs to make ends meet, if we're looking at families that are living in communities that are experiencing that same difficulty in economic security, what will that look like if we can continue to advance some of these progressive issues of health care benefits, paid family leave, sick leave, and how does that impact community cohesion as a whole to really play in a protective factor for intimate partner violence victimization. And so this model that they built really looks at how the work that they are doing is, again, connected back to those workplace issues that they're starting to work within as an organization.
Right. And I know Rebecca was talking about both intimate partner violence perpetration and victimization prevention through this, and how these different worker supports policies, she was expanding the lens to not just thinking about it at a family relationship level, which is often where we may stop in thinking about like economic security for families, but thinking about how, well, when all families in the community are experiencing these, how does that actually change the community conditions? And so kind of moving one level up to not just the family level, but also the community level, and the conditions that are being created when families do have economic security, which means then the neighborhoods have economic security as well. So Erin, I know that the Ohio Women's Public Policy Network is a key partner. You've been able to speak quite a bit about Rebecca's work, which we really appreciate. Can you share more with us what the network does?
Of course. And I touched on this a little bit, but would love to just talk very briefly a little bit more about us as a coalition and as an organization. So we are a coalition that was formed in 2015. We're convened by an organization called Innovation Ohio Education Fund. And we bring together more than 30 organizations that are working collaboratively to advance policies that create economic security for women and strengthen families. So again, we're looking at every single policy issue through a gender lens to talk about how women and their families are impacted by public policies at the local level, mostly focused at the state level, and then also looking at the federal level and how we can be a voice for Ohio at the federal landscape. We are really united by a shared vision where women, particularly women of color and other marginalized women, have the resources to thrive and opportunity to lead economically secure, safe, and healthy lives. And that all goes back to the work that we do to continue to advance proactive policy issues for women and their families at the state level. And so we have 3 main buckets of issues that we work on. Our policy agenda is very, very broad. As a coalition representing more than 30 organizations, our work encompasses really a lot of issues that impact women under, again, those 3 main buckets of promoting economic security for women and their families, ensuring fairness and opportunity in the workplace, and improving women's health and well-being, all tied back to that economic security lens that we apply to every single issue that we work on.
Great. And I just wanted to reiterate here that I think it's so important that the Ohio network decided to partner with groups that are already engaged in this space, and it really for them wasn't about reinventing the wheel, but like, you know, trying to build momentum where there's already progress happening. So how did the Ohio Women's Policy Network and the Ohio Domestic Violence Network start working together? And I know you've already shared a little bit about that, but we'd like to hear more about, you know, what's the process been with setting up the Wage Equity Work Group, which is the WOWs. I know there's a question in the text chat, so it stands for Wage Equity and Other Worker Supports. So what's the process been like for setting that up?
So as I mentioned at the beginning, the Women's Public Policy Network had been working with the Domestic Violence Network in previous years. They were one of our coalition partners. But this was new this was a new kind of lane that we were starting to do work on when Rebecca approached us about joining with their Delta Impact grant. And so as I shared at the beginning, they were kind of looking at the landscape of who are the groups that are working specifically with, at the beginning, minimum wage, but also the broader workplace issues here in Ohio. So in July, they convened that WOWS, we can call it WOWS from now on, it's a little easier than the full name, working group, which would break off separate from the Delta Impact leadership team, just so we could have those, more in-depth conversations about these, the wage equity policy issues. So as Rebecca kind of shared, as we were continuing to do work with her, she considered themselves kind of the new kid on the block of making sure that they were getting up to speed on a lot of these workplace policy issues, really understanding that a lot of us who are a part of this group had these relationships working on these issues for many years previously. So she really left that meeting feeling energized with the work that we were doing, really wanting to get deeper into her knowledge and her expertise on a lot of these workplace issues. From that initial conversation, we knew that there were a few folks who were still missing from the table. So with some feedback we gave Rebecca and some feedback from some other partners, she reached out to some new folks as well to join onto this, this WOWS working group. So they pulled in the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, which is a foundation that also does advocacy and policy work. They do a lot around training employers about implicit gender bias and really tackling gender equity, again, applying a gender lens to a lot of these different issues that they focus on. Then they added the Health Policy Institute of Ohio, which is involved in a lot of health equity work. They convened the Ohio Infant Mortality Advisory Group, and some of the strategies that they have funded by the state of Ohio have really helped to improve health outcomes for women specifically. And in addition to this working group, they added a few other partners to their leadership team who really worked through a racial and gender lens, specifically focusing on Black women. Given the disproportionate impact that Black women face with infant and maternal mortality and poverty, they knew this was an important way to make sure that folks were involved in their leadership team. So they also pulled in Restoring Our Own Through Transformation, or ROOT, which specifically serves Black mothers here in Central Ohio and I think a few other cities here in Ohio. And then the United Negro Women Central Ohio chapter, which is also represented on their leadership team level.
Great. So earlier on, we asked the audience about where there's been some momentum within this economic security work. And so I know that through your work, you've been working in some particular areas. Wondering if you can really briefly just share a little bit about that.
Of course, I know I'm going a little bit over my time. So a few of the main issues that we work on as a coalition that I wanted to highlight were increasing the minimum wage and eliminating the tipped wage, improving the state earned income tax credit to benefit more working women, increasing access to paid family and medical leave and paid sick days, increasing affordability of childcare and expanding public preschool, ensuring pension protection and retirement security, and increasing access to affordable housing and housing security. And I know that was something that was talked about earlier on, of making sure that housing security is a part of this broader conversation with economic security and supports for women specifically. As an organization, one of the issues I wanted to just touch on very briefly, and one of the issues that we really focus on as an organization and a coalition with our partners, is paid family leave. So we've played a leading role in advancing the issue at the local level to help, I think 7 now municipalities here in Ohio have introduced standalone paid leave policies for their municipal workers. And then we've worked at the state level to help support legislators who were introducing a state paid family leave policy. In 2016, for the first time in Ohio's history, we worked in partnership with state legislators to introduce a standalone paid family leave bill that would enact a insurance policy for workers in Ohio to have access to paid leave. This was reintroduced this past year, and a lot of the work that we're doing, because of the makeup of the legislature here in Ohio, leaning usually against a lot of the issues that we care about and that we are working on, is really starting that conversation and building relationships and building support for a policy to eventually work across the next few years to enact a policy here in Ohio, and pushing for a federal policy as well. And so this past time when we worked with the legislators to reintroduce the bill, we were able to get one Republican member signed on as a co-sponsor of the bill, and one of our partners hosted a lobby day that we worked on them with, where 300 people from across the state came in, and paid leave was one of those conversations that was talked about during the day. And then when folks went and met with their legislators, about 100 to 150 people actually went and met in person with their legislators that day. Paid family leave was one of the issues that they talked about and they advocated for, and they asked their members to support. And so a lot of that work was really building coalitions, building support, having that conversation to make sure that paid leave becomes one of those issues that continues to move and eventually passed in the state or at the federal level.
That's great work that you've all been doing, Erin. So we're going to pivot over to Alaska, and then we'll bring you back at the end, Erin, to join our group discussion. So thank you so much for everything you've shared so far and for helping fill in for Rebecca today. So I'd now like to introduce our guests from Alaska. We have Kristen, who is the prevention specialist at the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, and the project director of the CDC grant Delta Impact in Alaska. Kristen comes from a global health background with additional experience in microfinance and financial inclusion. So I'm sure Kristen's enjoying this economic security work. Kristen has a MS in International Development Management. Prior to this position, she conducted research on the state of infant partner violence prevention evidence globally. We also have Natasha, who's also from the network, and Natasha is the sole policy specialist. As a public servant at heart, she has extensive experience in crafting and influencing policy to bring the voices of underserved populations to the forefront. She brings experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors with a wealth of experience to offer the domestic violence and sexual assault field that will be particularly helpful in engaging with prevention and gender pay equity efforts. And last but not least, we have Jackie, who is joining us from the YWCA Alaska as the Women's Economic Empowerment Manager. Jackie has an extensive background in community development and financial education program design. Prior to working at YWCA, she worked to create and implement programs for Native community development financial institutions across the country, which sounds very interesting to me. So I want to ask all of you, and specifically Kristen and Natasha working at the network, we'd love to hear how you got started on working on economic opportunities and how this issue is arising in your local context in Alaska.
Thanks, Alicia. So we are the statewide dual DVSA coalition. We have 19 member organizations across a very large and diverse state. Erin gave some great background about the basics of issues around economic support, so we won't repeat that, but I will talk about how we entered the space, and then Natasha will give you a bit more context about the environment that we're operating in here in Alaska. So the network has dabbled in this topic before, gender pay equity, raising awareness at a few different events. But this is a new space for the prevention team, so it's a really exciting area to step into. And it fits really well with our strategic goal to expand primary prevention efforts and at all levels of the social ecological model. So the Delta Impact grant is focused specifically on the community and societal levels of the SEM, and within this is a focus area of economic supports for families. So looking at when we were first applying to this grant, we looked around at a couple different topics that could fit within this focus area. And we were looking to see where we might be able to contribute something, where there was already a bit of momentum, so we're not totally fighting an uphill battle. And while this is a 5-year grant, it still feels like a very short time frame for such huge topics and huge issues. So we wanted something that we felt that we could push the needle, if only a little bit. So after some research, our team landed on addressing the gender pay gap as it met those criteria. There was already some momentum in this area through the YWCA and other organizations within Alaska, and it felt like we could make a bit of a difference in this area.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And this is Natasha. I'm really excited to be working in this area again. When I came over to work for the network, my prior role, I ran the Senate Labor and Commerce Committee for the state of Alaska last year, and so I'm just really excited to have this intersectionality happen here. And this effort really advances the strategic goals of prevention that Kristen mentioned for the network, and also our second goal of advancing collaborative partnerships to be most effective in our response to and prevention of domestic violence and sexual assault. Alaska, we are currently in a years-long recession that started in late 2015. 3 of our prominent industries, oil and gas, government, and construction jobs, have been steadily in decline. Alaska's Department of Labor and Workforce Development reported in April this year that our economy has been losing jobs for 31 consecutive months. Businesses are having to make changes in response to the recession, and given great change, there doesn't exist an opportunity, though, for there to be an impact on pay equity and efforts to close the gap. So just because things are looking gloomy in our economy, I actually see this as an area of opportunity, just given that we are examining wages and pay constantly since the recession has been front and center. Luckily, as Kristen said, we're not starting from scratch, as different entities have been researching. The Department of Labor highlights through their Economic Trends publication every year, and they provide data, research, and awareness of the issue. Given that our gender wage gap is significantly high in comparison to other states, and it represents more than $1 billion in lost wages, it presents an opportunity to infuse money into our economy that's in recovery. Organizations are taking action to engage with our local businesses on how to change the social and economic barriers that women face, such as the work with the YWCA, which Jackie will introduce next.
Great. Thank you, Natasha and Kristen. So Jackie, we are so appreciative to have you here and representing the YWCA of Alaska. Can you share how you got started on working on these issues at the YWCA?
Of course. So the YWCA Alaska, our overall mission is to eliminate racism and empower women. And to reach that mission, we have 3 main programs, which is the Women's Wellness, Social Justice, and then my program, which is the Economic Empowerment. Then within Economic Empowerment, we have 2 projects, the Economic Justice Project, which focuses on the big picture of economic literacy through workforce development and financial management, which flows really well into our other project of Econ Equity. So our Econ Equity initiative was started in 2014 by our then CEO and board of directors. The vision for Econ Equity is to eliminate the gender pay gap in Alaska by 2025. The initiative works to reform Alaska's workplaces to not only guarantee women are paid equally, but also to ensure women are provided more and better opportunities to participate in the workforce at all levels. That's kind of how Econ Equity got started within YWCA Alaska.
Thanks, Jackie. So now we've kind of heard how AND VSA got started, how YWCA got started, lots of acronyms. And so we'd like to hear more about how did you identify a possible partnership between your 2 agencies?
Yeah, we have a really fun acronym that we like to play with. So when we were looking at this Delta Impact Grant, just like Rebecca in Ohio, we started to reach out to see who we could partner with. We knew this was an area that we didn't want to just dive in alone, that we recognized that our prevention background, it would be great to have partners who are already in this space and to which we could work with, but that we're not just kind of blindly busting into an area that we didn't have the full context with. So we started asking around, and a local connection said, hey, you should really check out what the YWCA is doing. They've been doing some great work on pay equity for multiple years now. And we reached out to them and found that the Econ Equity Initiative just really fit well with the goals of both the Delta Impact Grant and of our organization. It fit well with this, these new areas of prevention in which we wanted to go, and it fit well with the risk and protective factors that we were looking at in this particular area. So we are really excited to partner with them. We are also partnering with the Strategic Prevention Solutions. They're providing the evaluation efforts for this grant in this area, so we're really excited to have such great partners in this area. And Jackie, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that YWCA recognized that NDVSA was a good fit with our Econ Equity for various reasons. And one is that we do currently work locally within the survivor and network, but also because ANDVSA has the knowledge and expertise to really leverage a broader impact for the initiative. So the ability to get us throughout the state.
That's great. And I think we're going to get into a little bit more in this discussion of what the added value is. So we look forward to hearing more then. I wanted to pose a quick text chat question for our audience again. So I know that many of you shared some priority economic issues in your community, and I know all of you are in different places. Some of you may have already started taking some action. Some of you may be thinking about it, and that's why you're on this call. So I wanted to ask, what are some initial actions that you could take through your agency or organization? Or if you're already taking some action, we'd love to hear what you're doing. So if you can share that in the text chat, and we'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. And back to the team in Alaska, I understand that you're in the early stages of your work since your grant is fairly new, and we know this is all still new for you. But what are your high-level plans to address the problems that you've identified with the gender pay gap?
So this is Jackie, and I'll kind of start off. Currently, we're seeing in Alaska that women make about 68 cents on the dollar in relation to men. So this initiative seeks to reduce that through a three-element approach. And the first is to focus on the economic impact of the gap rather than the social injustice of unequal pay. Second, it's intentionally avoiding legislation and political routes as the main source of the problem. And then the third is implementing a two-pronged approach focused on changing the economic, educational, and social dynamics that contribute to the gender pay gap. And that would be one, working directly with businesses and organizations to create gender-balanced workplaces, and then two, furthering the education of women and girls on issues related to career choice and salary negotiation. So with that, we really do work one-on-one with women and girls, as well as providing classes and other things. Through the engagement of businesses, we have identified that those that have good policies and we have identified those that have good policies and processes on closing the gap, and we focus to bring that practice to others. The engagement takes on many forms, such as public endorsement campaigns, asking people to sign on to support of Econ Equity, and by signing on, we really are having them sign a declaration saying that they are in support of it. community meetings, allowing a forum that is safe to share concerns and ideas, a social marketing campaign, and then we currently have a survey that we worked on to create that is called Best Alaskan Companies for Working Women. And this survey really breaks down the policies and pay in organizations and rates where they are excelling and where improvements may be made. The survey is still in its early stages and only a handful of businesses have participated, but people are interested in that. Kristen, did you have anything else?
Yeah. So hearing what all the YWCA is doing, ANDVSA thought about how we can both support and complement this work. And we liked the YWCA's approach of focusing on businesses and also on this idea that before sweeping changes, you just need to start with some fundamental awareness issues, changing that awareness, changing attitudes, and shifting how people are thinking about this problem. So we took that idea and we will be supporting the YWCA's work with businesses and also working at other levels to just educate, just get some information out there. And so we'll be working with the YWCA on helping craft messages, getting the key information out there, strategizing, using our own network as we mentioned, since we are, our member organizations are spread throughout the state. And we like this approach of working primarily a little earlier on in the causal chain, not necessarily just jumping towards huge changes, but providing information, engaging businesses and other stakeholders in conversations, and once people have information, once they are more comfortable with talking about the subject, once they're looking at it in different ways of like how is closing a pay gap actually good for your business, actually good for the economy, then there are steps. The YWCA has steps for businesses if they want to dive in further. And then Natasha, do you want to speak more about what else we're doing?
Great, yeah, thank you, Kristen. And that, I mean, Kristen just framed it really, really well, and Jackie also. We want to use the network and our policy efforts to complement what the YWCA is doing. We have a large, broad reach across the state, so we can help to raise awareness and get the information out in a different manner than the YWCA can, and it'll be a really great partnership. And we also want to frame it around what is good for business and what is good for the economy, given our recession that we're in. We have a very risk-averse climate, so we want to tailor this and walk alongside businesses. We're not trying to force them to do anything. We're showing them that this is a benefit, and that's really something that we want to highlight, that $1 billion that we can really infuse into the economy.
Thank you. There's a question in the text chat with along the lines of what you're saying right now. I was initially going to ask Jackie, but Natasha, you just touched on it too. The question is, what is an example of a message framed around economics as opposed to social justice? Wondering if you could quickly answer that.
I think for us, looking at the YWCA, really kind of framing it around the workforce development, the economics, the pay gap, as opposed to social justice as of it just being an inequality, and then focusing on that inequality as where, from the economic standpoint, we're coming in and saying, well, here's what we can do, and here's the means to do it, and how people are doing it. So, Natasha, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Jackie, that's great. And I think that encapsulates it very well. And in this risk-averse climate, we just want to show the value added and not necessarily dictate what that looks like. We want to start this dialogue with businesses, showing that it's good for business, and keep highlighting that and work on our partnerships.
Yes.
Thank you both. And yeah, I think that how you frame these issues depends on your local context. So you're really going to need to see what's going to work where you are, and think about your framing through that lens. So I want to move on to our discussion and bring back Erin from Ohio. And I had created this little table because I just thought we have a lot of people on this call today, and we have so much expertise both within the field of sexual and domestic violence prevention and from partners that may not be directly in this field but more peripherally. And so, just with this wealth of experience, we want to hear more about how those within the field may be dealing with pushback that is outside of the prevention lane, and how you navigate with being new in this space. So I know that Rebecca's not with us, so maybe if Kristen and Natasha, if you could take this question. Have you had any pushback yet? If you were to get pushback, what would you say? What's kind of that added value? And, how are you going about being new in this space?
Yeah, thanks for that. No specific direct pushback yet. Definitely some questions about why we are entering that space. And I think this is a great opportunity for prevention folk in particular to really explain to, like, putting on my prevention nerd hat here, these different levels of the social ecological model. So, a lot of traditional primary prevention is in just particular areas, and this is just simply a new area within the community and societal levels of that model. And I think it's great to take that opportunity to explain the connections between economic insecurity and violence, to explain how income stability can be a protective factor. And so navigating within this new space, my experience so far, and I have not been in this space very long here in Alaska, but people have been very welcoming. Different organizations I've reached out and individuals. I think it's exciting when a new partner enters this space. And I don't want to speak for others, but the feeling I get is that if there's been an organization or an individual who has been working on pay equity, it's great to have new faces and new partners. The more the merrier in this fight to improve these inequities. So, and I think coming in as a DVSA organization, we're also just providing that different perspective. We're providing that, hey, there is a connection to violence here, and it's really important that we think about that, even though that's not necessarily what we're really digging into. We're being very mindful of our own climate, as we've talked about, but I think, we still kind of, we bring a different perspective. Natasha, do you want to?
Yeah. Similar, I think initial reactions might be, why are we working on this as a network? But when you kind of start to examine the disparities in pay and the benefits of closing the gap, it starts to make sense. And from a policy perspective, I hope to add some value to this effort, to be nimble, since we do have such a risk-averse climate, and help businesses to see that it's a value added. We're not here to tell them what to do. We're here to help and provide more tools. And it really does just align with our strategic goals of prevention and partnerships. It's good for business. It reduces violence through many ways. For example, we have an extremely high cost of living in our state, and our member programs say affordable housing is one of our highest priorities. And I've seen some folks on the webinar have also said that in the chat box. And so this is just one way. Addressing gender pay gap can start help bridging that gap and help individuals to afford housing. It's really a win-win.
So I also want to open it up to the audience. So for those of you participating today, how do you deal with pushback? If you've experienced it, or how would you deal with pushback? So please feel free to share in the text chat if you've had any experiences with this in your initial work you've been doing. With talking to Rebecca, I know that she also mentioned how their network has access to DV agencies across the state, and so by entering this space, it really adds value to the body of work, and having all these other agencies start thinking about this even internally with their own policies. And again, she really emphasized how it helps improve entire community conditions and think about perpetration prevention as well by thinking about economic security. So I would also now like to ask our partners from other sectors, both Erin and Jackie, being outside of the sexual and domestic violence prevention field, what value added have you seen or are you expecting to see by having your partners at these sexual and domestic violence agencies reach out to you and start working with you? So Erin, do you have anything to say here?
Yeah, I would say it absolutely adds value to our work. We know that women's lives are not in silos, so why, doing policy and advocacy work in those silos is really just detrimental to our progress and to the women that we are aiming to support and serve. So the whole purpose of the Women's Public Policy Network was really to bring together organizations that were working across issue areas so that we were stronger as a coalition and that each individual organization was stronger as well. So being able to bridge those connections between how domestic violence is connected to housing security, is connected to economic security, and how each and every one of those policy issues really connects together, helps us build out a stronger coalition and stronger work by having folks who are directly working in sexual and domestic violence prevention field.
Thanks, Erin. Jackie, anything to add? I know you already talked about this a little bit earlier on.
Yeah, I think, again, it's just really being able to work with an organization that has a statewide reach that is just invaluable. But also that they have the policy background, and that really helps to kind of understand the whole econ equity a bit more. So I think that's kind of the main.
That's great. So what's coming up in the text chat? Tori, do you want to share anything that's come up?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot about how there's not necessarily a lot of pushback, but there is a lot of excitement over this opportunity, especially once we connect it to larger issues like affordable housing. I also saw people talking about explaining the connections in depth a little bit more, using the social ecological model. And I also noticed we had a question pop up recently. Alicia, I'm wondering who we should ask that one to.
I think maybe I can try to take it. I know Rebecca's not here on the web conference, so I'll try my best to answer this one. So the question is, can you speak to how community economic stability works to deter perpetration? And I also invite our guests to chime in if you have anything to add here. So I think that the conceptual thinking around this and the pathway has to do with when there's increased financial arguments within households, how that can expand into further arguments and into like domestic violence through those pathways. And so when families, partners have less economic stress between them, it can help decrease perpetration in that way. But I wouldn't say I'm an expert on this topic. Not sure if anyone else has anything to add, or anyone that's participating today, if you want to chime in on the text chat, we definitely invite that too.
This is Kristen. I would like to say that, so there is some good research out there, but really this is an area in which we just need so much more. I would love to see more research in this area. So for example, there is a research article that was exploring economic independence as a protective factor. But when I was looking around, I just found that one article in terms of thinking about that particular protective factor. So there is some good research already, but there needs to be a lot more. But there are other articles out there that are looking at, that have more definitively identified, as Alicia was saying, economic insecurity and economic stress within a household is definitely an identified risk factor. But overall, I just, if there are researchers on the call right now, there is a need for even further rigorous studies in this area.
And this is Natasha from Alaska. Just a thought as bouncing off of Kristen here is that I do see as these housing efforts for homelessness, there's an effort to start collecting data there, and we've seen some of that here in our local, here in Southeast Alaska. But that could be something that complements this. But again, data is really necessary and needed.
Thank you both. So we'd like to kind of move into our closing of the session. It's gone by so quickly, but starting off with you, Erin, what are some of your next steps in your work with Rebecca, and what are some of your tips from Ohio for others who want to engage in this type of work?
So for next steps, it is going to be continuing to convene that work group, building capacity for where we can engage as a working group and with the work that the Domestic Violence is doing through their Delta Impact Project. Figuring out from Rebecca's perspective where their membership is at in terms of providing equitable economic opportunities. So doing an internal scan of those organizations that are a part of the leadership team to make sure that we ourselves as organizations have some of these proactive, equitable economic supports within our own organizations. Some of the tips that we have, that Rebecca and I kind of put together as we were considering this webinar is, and this was touched on, of considering the connection between these issues, not just violence, but the connected issues, making sure that we are getting people from outside the coalition looking at these interconnections. So talking with lawmakers about it, having other folks within our own networks and organizations outside of just this working group, talking with lawmakers about those connections as well. Pulling in the larger advocacy community, lawmakers, and community members to continue to move these policies forward by looking at them as kind of a package of issues, not just a single bill that stands alone and doesn't impact other parts of people's lives. Remembering, this is I think something that Rebecca has talked about, of remembering that wage equity can improve entire community conditions. Again, going back to the previous question that one of the folks on the webinar had asked. And lastly, just making sure that in this work we're doing, we're centering those who are most impacted and that we're centering the people we actually want to serve in those policies, which again is a really important piece that the domestic violence brings of making sure that real people are behind every single one of these policy issues. It's not just an abstract bill on a piece of paper. This impacts real people's lives, and so making sure that we're centering women in the work that we are doing as organizations to advance policy and advocacy work.
Thank you, Erin. And I'd now like to move over to Alaska and hear what your next steps and tips are.
Great, thank you. This is Natasha, and really wanted to take away that you can start to raise awareness about this issue in an approach that is tailored to the current climate in your state. So just start asking questions. What's happening in the economy? What efforts are already underway? Since we're in a recession, it's going to impact our messaging and meet businesses really where they're at rather than trying to force ideas upon them that they're not ready for. And then, start asking questions, are there other efforts that could highlight pay equity? For example, our state is going to have a raise in the minimum wage next year. Is this an opportunity to also highlight pay equity efforts since we're going to be talking about wages?
And then Sorry.
We'll go for it.
One of the other tips, sorry, this is Jackie, as you engage in the work and kind of look at local partners, really look local first, and then from there you can kind of gain those key elements to kind of bring to the larger context. Sorry, Kristen?
Yeah, and this is Kristen. So just highlighting what both my colleagues already said, that for me, entering this space where, sure, I have some financial inclusion background, but this within Alaska, this is still a new space to me. So it's, I think for a DVSA organization, it's about being strategic and really understanding that context. And so Natasha brings such a great background to help us understand the broader political and legislative context in which we're operating, and the economic context. So for the prevention folk out there, talk with your policy people because they know many things. And in terms of identifying partners, I just sent out so many emails and made a lot of phone calls of just talking to people. I spoke with a former grad student who had looked into this issue within Alaska, and that connected me to other things. So just speaking with both statewide and local, state, and national entities and individuals working on this topic is just a great way to start. And so for our next steps, we're still at the beginning stages, so we're still continuing to build relationships with existing partners, where we're prepping our messaging, getting prepared to have community meetings, to have lunch and learns, to really start these important conversations, and we are really excited to do so.
Great. Yeah, I think my biggest takeaway from everything that's been shared is really the partnership piece, because there are people already doing really great work in many localities across the country, and it's how can we build more momentum and leverage our strengths in this space. So I really want to I really appreciate everyone joining us today, having representation from 2 different states and from both folks that are in the field of sexual and domestic violence prevention and those who are outside of it. They really added to the richness. And we did promise you that we were going to share some great tools and resources, as this is a getting started session. And so I'd like to hand it over to Ashley. Do you want to introduce Anne?
Sure. So Anne Menard from the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence has joined us to provide some of the resources. And Anne, I know that NRCDV has been working on this issue for many, many years. So we're excited to hear some of your insight and resources that you all have available.
Thanks, Ashley and Alicia, and it was so exciting to hear about the great work being done by Ohio and Alaska coalitions and their allies under their Delta Impact grants. And we really appreciate the opportunity to share some resources that we want you all to be aware of. Some of you may be very aware of them, but we never assume that that's the case. Let me see if I can, it does not, let me see, it's not moving forward. Thank you, if you can move things forward. So I'm, as a longtime economic empowerment and housing advocate, very excited to see the CDC technical packages for intimate partner violence and sexual assault lift up that strengthening economic supports for individuals, families, and communities as evidence-based intimate partner violence and sexual assault prevention strategies. This is so significant, and Alicia had the same feeling and introduced the technical packages, and it's come up a couple of times, but I just want to underscore that. So again, here are the particular categories that they lifted up and organized the available evidence, including the limited evidence on providing economic support as a perpetrator strategy, perpetration prevention strategy. So that is one place that you can look for the evidence that CDC found credible. So I just want to underscore that. So NRCDV as a national TA provider takes seriously our role as in identifying, promoting, and increasing access to resources that help advocates and allies move forward our shared work to end domestic violence and sexual assault. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but and to let you know that we have a handout that provides links to all of these resources that, again, I just want to highlight. So on this slide, it mashes together three particular kinds of resources. We have an NRCDV on VONET. VONET, our online resource library, has a number of online special collections, including one on employment and domestic violence. An online special collection is our effort to pull together not everything on a topic, but those things that we feel are going to be most useful to domestic and sexual violence advocates and allied organizations. We want people to be able to find resources easily, but also to bump into other resources that they might not have been looking for because they didn't know they existed, but the special collection helps them see. Also to the right of this slide is a practice guide developed by Jill Davies and Deb Linnell, who many of you know their work, on building mission-effective and survivor-defined organizations. It focuses on how to grow and change your organizations in ways that make survivors of violence safer, and certainly this new focus on economic empowerment is a great example of something we need. We need more folks to feel comfortable integrating. Also, at the bottom left of the slide, wanted to make sure that folks knew about the Workplaces Respond to Domestic Violence website. That is a collaborative. It's led by Futures Without Violence, and it has a wealth of information around workplace policies and also just working with corporations and businesses about and changing their policies and practices. So again, another great resource. Can you move ahead? There we are. I wanted to highlight two other special collections on vonet.org, one on building credit and assets, and another on earned income tax credits and other tax credits, EITC. Particularly the earned income tax credit special collection is updated annually to include the incredible resources from our partners at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities on how to, including campaign materials to help survivors and again other families and individuals in communities know about the tax credits that they're eligible for and to support them in accessing these important financial resources. So I don't know if I'm moving things forward or if someone else is. I appreciate it, however that's happening. Also wanted to, again, highlight a project of our partners at National Network to End Domestic Violence in collaboration with the Allstate Foundation. The wonderful Serena Williams, for those of you who are tennis fans, is one of the spokespersons for this, this campaign. The Purple Purse initiative includes tools to both increase awareness of economic empowerment and a host of economic empowerment curriculum and other resources to directly support survivors to both avoid economic abuse or to recover if they've been a victim of economic abuse. So again, another really great initiative if you weren't familiar with it. And here are just again, and I totally agree with several of the folks who've already stressed how important partnership building is. And here are some of the national organizations that are directly involved in this work. Moving along, again, there we are. I wanted to particularly point out the technical packages language that points to public benefits programs and the ways that they can be protective for survivers. The EITC is listed here as well, so this is particular language from the technical package, but that is a lead into two reports I want to, can someone advance for me? I'm not seeming to, it doesn't seem to be working. Two reports that we are recently released. One is difference between surviving and not surviving. This is a 2017 survey with over 1,100 responses from DV advocates and sexual assault advocates, as well as legal assistance providers, providing an updated picture of the experiences that survivors are having with public benefits programs, specifically TANF, the SNAPS programs, which is formerly known as food stamps, and unemployment insurance. So the study provides information, this survey provides a really good picture of the fact that the majority of respondents said that TANF, SNAP, and unemployment insurance are very critical resources for a significant number of survivors, that there are significant barriers to accessing these programs, and that there are important policy changes that could be made to reduce some of these barriers and increase access. And then another companion report that the NRC and Casa de Esperanza and the National Domestic Violence Hotline did is a survey of survivors, bringing in survivors' voices. What are their experiences with public benefits? So these are survivors who are reaching out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Over 280 survivors shared information about their experiences, the importance of benefits, the process of applying for benefits, the barriers, and the recommendations that they would make to improving access. So again, I really encourage you to access these reports and learn from both advocates working directly with survivors around public benefits, but also from survivors themselves about how critical these programs are to them. And I'm so excited to hear that housing was identified. There is a safehousingpartnerships.org is a website about 1.5 years old now that the NRC supports with a number of our housing partners, provides information, provides the latest research on the intersection of sexual assault, domestic violence, and housing, provides tools, models, and really trying to pull all that information together and make it more accessible. Okay, moving on quickly. I told you I was going to move quickly. This is the handout, just a picture of the handout, which has links to all of those resources and many more. That is a support to implementing the technical package. And then I also wanted to make sure that people were aware of preventipv.org, which is a website focused on promoting tools and strategies learned by state and territory coalitions and local programs across the country. And here's just a copy of the front page, but more importantly, it includes a tools inventory, which is our way of helping to identify and lift up and make more accessible peer-generated resources, how folks are moving prevention into communities, working with communities to really make those efforts robust and impactful. And particularly the tools, and I'm going to show you some pictures of the tools inventory. There we go. So if you search under the searchable tools toolbox, there's lots of resources in there. If you search under campaigns, this would be the first page that would come up. You click on any one of these, these graphics, you will get information on what the campaign included, guidance on implementing a similar campaign in your community, translation, adaptation guidance, and contact information. So you can see that this is just the first page that you would get if you searched under campaigns. If you searched under systems change, these are the kinds of things that you would find. We have made a concerted intentional effort to increase the representation of tools that have integrated racial equity work with our gender justice advocacy and economic justice that are doing work in an intersectional and multifaceted way. If you search under coalition building, here's another set of resources that you would have an opportunity to learn more about pretty easily. So, and again, you can see the different kinds of campaigns. We're also focused on including the language access or tools that are in different languages. And I think my last slide, this is a shared horizon that has emerged from some really engaging movement building work that coalitions and local programs and national organizations on DV and sexual assault organizations have been working on over the last several years. And this, again, reflects the belief that if we aren't clear about where we're going, we're never going to get there. So I just want to end with this depiction of how all of these things are necessary in order for us to truly have safe and healthy communities. So I'm done. I don't know who I'm turning it back to, probably Ashley or Alicia. I'll turn it back to Alicia since your picture came up.
Thanks, Anne. And thank you for all those resources. So many things for us to check out, and glad that all of that is available. There are a few more resources specific to this session from our guests, but due to time, we're going to just recommend you downloading the slides to access them. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ashley to close us out.
Thanks, Alicia. Thank you all so much, Anne. Thank you for providing that wealth of resources and the handout that we also have on our website. If you weren't getting those quick enough, you can go ahead and access that, and you'll see links to all of those wonderful resources. We really appreciate you being part of this. And I just want to thank our wonderful presenters from Ohio and Alaska for sharing this awesome work that you're doing. That's so interesting. It's so kind of forward-thinking, and I know there's so many lessons still to be learned, and so we hope to be able to check back in with you. And to everyone else for joining us, thank you for your participation, for your questions, for participating in the text chat. We're really glad that you are with us today, and we hope that you got some good information out of this. If you have questions, feel free to send me an email. We'll also let you know when the recording's available, but you can access the PowerPoint slides and some of those other resources now. So I just wanted to thank you all again and let you know that this concludes our web conference for today, and we hope to see you next month. Take care.